Part III. Swann in Love. Section 2. Occasionally a couple of my grandparents' acquaintance, who had been complaining for some time that they never saw Swann now, would announce with satisfaction, and perhaps with a slight inclination to make my grandparents envious of them, that he had suddenly become as charming as he could possibly be, and was never out of their house. My grandfather would not care to shatter their pleasant illusion, but would look at my grandmother as he hummed the air of "What is this mystery? I cannot understand it," or of "Vision fugitive, in matters such as this 'tis best to close one's eyes." A few months later, if my grandfather asked Swann's new friend, "What about Swann? Do you still see as much of him as ever?" the other's face would lengthen. "Never mention his name to me again." "But I thought that you were such friends." He had been intimate in this way for several months with some cousins of my grandmother, dining almost every evening at their house. Suddenly, and without any warning, he ceased to appear. They supposed him to be ill, and the lady of the house was going to send to inquire for him, when in her kitchen she found a letter in his hand, which her cook had left by accident in the housekeeping book. In this he announced that he was leaving Paris, and would not be able to come to the house again. The cook had been his mistress, and at the moment of breaking off relations she was the only one of the household whom he had thought it necessary to inform. But when his mistress for the time being was a woman in society, or at least one whose birth was not so lowly, nor her position so irregular that he was unable to arrange for her reception in society, then for her sake he would return to it, but only to the particular orbit in which she moved, or into which he had drawn her. "No good depending on Swann for this evening," people would say. "Don't you remember it's his Americans' night at the opera?" He would secure invitations for her to the most exclusive drawing rooms, to those houses where he himself went regularly, for weekly dinners or for poker. Every evening, after a slight wave imparted to his stiffly brushed red locks had tempered with a certain softness the ardor of his bold green eyes, he would select a flower for his buttonhole, and set out to meet his mistress at the house of one or other of the women of his circle. And then, thinking of the affection and admiration which the fashionable folk, whom he always treated exactly as he pleased, would, when he met them there, lavish upon him in the presence of the woman whom he loved, he would find a fresh charm in that worldly existence of which he had grown weary, but whose substance, pervaded and warmly colored by the flickering light which he had slipped into its midst, seemed to him beautiful and rare, now that he had incorporated in it a fresh love. But while each of these attachments, each of these flirtations had been the realization, more or less complete, of a dream born of the sight of a face or a form which Swann had spontaneously and without effort on his part found charming, it was quite another matter when one day at the theatre he was introduced to Odette de Crécy by an old friend of his own, who had spoken of her to him as a ravishing creature, with whom he might very possibly come to an understanding, but had made her out to be harder of conquest than she actually was, so as to appear to be conferring a special favor by the introduction. She had struck Swann not, certainly, as being devoid of beauty, but as endowed with a style of beauty which left him indifferent, which aroused in him no desire, which gave him indeed a sort of physical repulsion, as one of those women of whom every man can name some, and each will name different examples, who are the converse of the type which our senses demand. To give him any pleasure her profile was too sharp, her skin too delicate, her cheek bones too prominent, her features too tightly drawn. Her eyes were fine, but so large that they seemed to be bending beneath their own weight, strained the rest of her face, and always made her appear unwell or in an ill humor. Some time after this introduction at the theatre, she had written to ask Swann whether she might see his collections, which would interest her so much, she, an ignorant woman with a taste for beautiful things, saying that she would know him better when once she had seen him in his home, where she imagined him to be so comfortable with his tea and his books, although she had not concealed her surprise at his being in that part of the town, which must be so depressing, and was not nearly smart enough for such a very smart man. And when he allowed her to come, she had said to him as she left, how sorry she was to have stayed so short a time in a house into which she was so glad to have found her way at last, speaking of him as though he had meant something more to her than the rest of the people she knew, and appearing to unite their two selves with a kind of romantic bond which had made him smile. But at the time of life, tinged already with disenchantment, which Swann was approaching, when a man can content himself with being in love for the pleasure of loving, without expecting too much in return, this linking of hearts, if it is no longer, as in early youth, the goal towards which love of necessity tends, still is bound to love by so strong an association of ideas that it may well become the cause of love if it presents itself first. In his younger days a man dreams of possessing the heart of the woman whom he loves. Later, the feeling that he possesses the heart of a woman may be enough to make him fall in love with her. And 50, at an age when it would appear, since one seeks in love before everything else is subjective pleasure, that the taste for feminine beauty must play the larger part in its procreation, love may come into being, love of the most physical order without any foundation in desire. At this time of life a man has already been wounded more than once by the darts of love. It no longer evolves by itself, obeying its own incomprehensible and fatal laws, before his passive and astonished heart. We come to its aid, we falsify it by memory and by suggestion. Recognizing one of its symptoms, we recall and recreate the rest. Since we possess its hymn, engraved on our hearts in its entirety, there is no need of any woman to repeat the opening lines, potent with the admiration which her beauty inspires, for us to remember all that follows. And if she begin in the middle, where it sings of our existing, henceforward, for one another only, we are well enough attuned to that music to be able to take it up and follow our partner without hesitation at the first pause in her voice. Odette de Crécy came again to see Swann. Her visits grew more frequent, and doubtless each visit revived the sense of disappointment which he felt at the sight of a face whose details he had somewhat forgotten in the interval, not remembering it as either so expressive or, in spite of her youth, so faded. He used to regret, while she was talking to him, that her really considerable beauty was not of the kind which he spontaneously admired. It must be remarked that Odette's face appeared thinner and more prominent than it actually was, because her forehead and the upper part of her cheeks, a single and almost plain surface, were covered by the masses of hair which women wore at that period, drawn forward in a fringe, raised in crimped waves, and falling in stray locks over her ears. While as for her figure, and she was admirably built, it was impossible to make out its continuity on account of the fashion then prevailing, and in spite of her being one of the best dressed women in Paris, for the corset, jetting forward in an arch as though over an imaginary stomach, and ending in a sharp point, beneath which bulged out the balloon of her double skirts, gave a woman that year the appearance of being composed of different sections badly fitted together. To such an extent did the frills, the flounces, the inner bodice follow in complete independence, controlled only by the fancy of their designer or the rigidity of their material, the line which led them to the knots of ribbon, falls of lace, fringes of vertically hanging jet, or carried them along the bust, but nowhere attached themselves to the living creature, who, according as the architecture of their fripperies drew them towards or away from her own, found herself either straight-laced to suffocation or else completely buried. But, after Odette had left him, Swann would think with a smile of her telling him how the time would drag until he allowed her to come again. He remembered the anxious, timid way in which she had once begged him that it might not be very long, and the way in which she had looked at him then, fixing upon him her fearful and imploring gaze, which gave her a touching air beneath the bunches of artificial pansies fastened in the front of her round bonnet of white straw, tied with strings of black velvet. "And won't you," she had ventured, "come just once and take tea with me?" He had pleaded pressure of work, an essay, which in reality he had abandoned years ago, on Vermeer of Delft. "I know that I am quite useless," she had replied, "a little wild thing like me beside a learned great man like you. I should be like the frog in the fable. And yet I should so much like to learn, to know things, to be initiated. What fun it would be to become a regular bookworm, to bury my nose in a lot of old papers," she had gone on, with that self-satisfied air which a smart woman adopts when she insists that her one desire is to give herself up, without fear of soiling her fingers, to some unclean task, such as cooking the dinner, with her hands right in the dish itself. "You will only laugh at me, but this painter who stops you from seeing me," she meant Vermeer, "I have never even heard of him. Is he alive still? Can I see any of his things in Paris, so as to have some idea of what is going on behind that great brow which works so hard, that head which I feel sure is always puzzling away about things, just to be able to say, 'There, that's what he's thinking about'? What a dream it would be to be able to help you with your work." He had sought an excuse in his fear of forming new friendships, which he gallantly described as his fear of a hopeless passion. "You are afraid of falling in love? How funny that is, when I go about seeking nothing else, and would give my soul just to find a little love somewhere," she had said, so naturally and with such an air of conviction that he had been genuinely touched. "Some woman must have made you suffer, and you think that the rest are all like her. She can't have understood you. You are so utterly different from ordinary men. That's what I liked about you when I first saw you. I felt at once that you weren't like everybody else. And then, besides, there's yourself," he had continued. "I know what women are. You must have a whole heap of things to do, and never any time to spare." "I? Why, I have never anything to do. I am always free, and I always will be free if you want me. At whatever hour of the day or night it may suit you to see me, just send for me, and I shall be only too delighted to come. Will you do that? Do you know what I should really like? To introduce you to Madame Verdurin, where I go every evening. Just fancy my finding you there, and thinking that it was a little for my sake that you had gone." No doubt, in thus remembering their conversations, in thinking about her thus when he was alone, he did no more than call her image into being among those of countless other women in his romantic dreams. But if, thanks to some accidental circumstance, or even perhaps without that assistance, for the circumstance which presents itself at the moment when a mental state, hitherto latent, makes itself felt, may well have had no influence whatsoever upon that state, the image of Odette de Crécy came to absorb the whole of his dreams. If from those dreams the memory of her could no longer be eliminated, then her bodily imperfections would no longer be of the least importance, nor would the conformity of her body, more or less than any other, to the requirements of Swann's taste; since, having become the body of her whom he loved, it must henceforth be the only one capable of causing him joy or anguish. It so happened that my grandfather had known, which was more than could be said of any other actual acquaintance, the family of these Verdurins. But he had entirely severed his connection with what he called young Verdurin, taking a general view of him as one who had fallen, though without losing hold of his millions, among the riffraff of Bohemia. One day he received a letter from Swann asking whether my grandfather could put him in touch with the Verdurins. "On guard! On guard!" he exclaimed as he read it. "I am not at all surprised. Swann was bound to finish up like this. A nice lot of people! I cannot do what he asks, because, in the first place, I no longer know the gentleman in question. Besides, there must be a woman in it somewhere, and I don't mix myself up in such matters. Ah, well, we shall see some fun if Swann begins running after the little Verdurins." And on my grandfather's refusal to act as sponsor, it was Odette herself who had taken Swann to the house. The Verdurins had had dining with them, on the day when Swann made his first appearance, Dr. and Madame Cottard, the young pianist and his aunt, and the painter then in favor, while these were joined, in the course of the evening, by several more of the faithful. Dr. Cottard was never quite certain of the tone in which he ought to reply to any observation, or whether the speaker was jesting or in earnest, and so in any event he would embellish all his facial expressions with the offer of a conditional, a provisional smile, whose expectant subtlety would exonerate him from the charge of being a simpleton, if the remark addressed to him should turn out to have been facetious. But as he must also be prepared to face the alternative, he never dared to allow this smile a definite expression on his features, and you would see there a perpetually flickering uncertainty in which you might decipher the question that he never dared to ask, "Do you really mean that?" He was no more confident of the manner in which he ought to conduct himself in the street, or indeed in life generally, than he was in a drawing room, and he might be seen greeting passers by, carriages, and anything that occurred with a malicious smile which absolved his subsequent behavior of all impropriety, since it proved, if it should turn out unsuited to the occasion, that he was well aware of that, and that if he had assumed a smile, the jest was a secret of his own. On all these points, however, where a plain question appeared to him to be permissible, the doctor was unsparing in his endeavors to cultivate the wilderness of his ignorance and uncertainty, and so to complete his education. So it was that, following the advice given him by a wise mother, on his first coming up to the capital from his provincial home, he would never let pass either a figure of speech or a proper name that was new to him without an effort to secure the fullest information upon it. As regards figures of speech, he was insatiable in his thirst for knowledge, for often imagining them to have a more definite meaning than was actually the case, he would want to know what exactly was intended by those which he most frequently heard used: devilish pretty, blue blood, a cat and dog life, a day of reckoning, a queen of fashion, to give a free hand, to be at a deadlock, and so forth, and in what particular circumstances he himself might make use of them in conversation. Failing these, he would adorn it with puns and other plays upon words which he had learned by rote. As for the names of strangers which were uttered in his hearing, he used merely to repeat them to himself in a questioning tone, which, he thought, would suffice to furnish him with explanations for which he would not ostensibly seek. As the critical faculty, on the universal application of which he prided himself, was in reality completely lacking, that refinement of good breeding which consists in assuring some one whom you are obliging in any way, without expecting to be believed, that it is really yourself that is obliged to him, was wasted on Cotard, who took everything that he heard in its literal sense. However blind she may have been to his faults, Madame Verdurin was genuinely annoyed, though she still continued to regard him as brilliantly clever, when, after she had invited him to see and hear Sarah Bernhardt from a stage box, and had said politely, "It is very good of you to have come, doctor, especially as I'm sure you must often have heard Sarah Bernhardt, and besides, I'm afraid we're rather too near the stage." The doctor, who had come into the box with a smile which waited before settling upon or vanishing from his face until some one in authority should enlighten him as to the merits of the spectacle, replied, "To be sure, we are far too near the stage, and one is getting sick of Sarah Bernhardt. But you expressed a wish that I should come. For me, your wish is a command. I am only too glad to be able to do you this little service. What would one not do to please you? You are so good." And he went on, "Sarah Bernhardt, that's what they call the voice of God, ain't it? You see often, too, that she sets the boards on fire. That's an odd expression, ain't it?" in the hope of an enlightening commentary, which, however, was not forthcoming. "Do you know," Madame Verdurin had said to her husband, "I believe we are going the wrong way to work when we depreciate anything we offer the doctor. He is a scientist who lives quite apart from our everyday existence. He knows nothing himself of what things are worth, and he accepts everything that we say as gospel." "I never dared to mention it," Monsieur Verdurin had answered, "but I've noticed the same thing myself." And on the following New Year's Day, instead of sending Dr. Cotard a ruby that cost 3,000 francs, and pretending that it was a mere trifle, Monsieur Verdurin bought an artificial stone for 300, and let it be understood that it was something almost impossible to match. End of Part 3, Section 2.